The vampire is one of the most iconic monsters of all time.
I assume I need no introduction.
Along with zombies, werewolves, and ghosts, they have been a mainstay in popular media for over 100 years. Over this time, vampires have appeared in various forms, often changing along with society. But where did this myth originate?
Alright, now that we all agree that we're dealing with vampires, what do we know about vampires?
The undead feature in every culture on Earth, going back thousands of years. However, the vampire as we currently understand it only emerged much later. Specifically, it has its origins in Eastern European folklore. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, legends emerged in this part of the world which described blood-sucking undead creatures. In Albania, these monsters were called striga, and in Greece, virolakas. However, the origin of the word vampire is not entirely clear. Most writers attribute these early vampire myths to people's ignorance about the human body's decomposition after death. From this perspective, vampires, like many mythical monsters, were an attempt by pre-industrial people to explain the mysteries of death. In this regard, early vampire tales were also influenced by ideas and practices from Christianity, particularly those of the Greek Orthodox Church. In addition, vampire folklore in Eastern Europe drew on some real-life figures from the region's history, such as the Wallachian warlord Vlad Tepes, who is alleged to have tortured and killed thousands of people. Similarly, some writers have suggested that these vampire legends may also have been metaphors for contagious diseases. But the vampire myth only really accelerated in the 17th and 18th centuries, around the time of the Enlightenment. This was an intellectual and philosophical movement centered around ideas such as the importance of reason and empirical evidence. Nick Groom says that the modern idea of the vampire emerged out of the clash between traditional folklore and these new scientific principles. Vampires are not like other earlier supernatural monsters or undead apparitions. They are quite different because they are enlightenment beings. Groom writes, "They exist, have to exist, in a modern and rational world." After existing for over a century as folklore, the vampire made the jump to literature in the 1700s, first appearing in German writer Heinrich August Ossenfelder's poem Der Vampir in 1748. From here, the vampire would make its way into British literature in the early 19th century, where it would feature in the work of romantic writers like Lord Byron and John William Polidori. Polidori's tale The Vampire is particularly significant because it introduced the idea of the vampire as an aristocratic anti-hero. However, vampires only became widespread in popular culture after they appeared in penny dreadfuls. These were cheap, ultra-violent stories which were published serially and were popular amongst ordinary people. The most famous of these was Varney the Vampire, published in the 1840s. This story introduced several vampire tropes. For example, Varney leaves a distinctive bite mark, has superhuman strength, hypnotic powers, and, of course, fangs. Varney was also the first example of a sympathetic vampire, one who hates their condition but is unable to change it. But there were many ways in which Varney was different to the vampire as we currently know it. For example, he could go out during the day, had no fear of garlic or crosses.
Crosses hurt vampires. Do we have a cross?
Crosses don't do squat.
You have to have faith for this to work on me.
Most of these aspects of the vampire would appear for the first time in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula. Dracula is by far the most iconic and influential vampire story. It drew on the last 7 decades of vampire tales and distilled them into many of their modern forms. The aristocratic vampire of Polidori's story became Count Dracula, and the Eastern European origins of vampire folklore were the reason for the story's setting in Transylvania. Dracula also included the tropes introduced by Varney the Vampire, but added some new ones, like the idea of vampires having no reflection, something which has since become one of their central qualities. Dracula was also the first story to feature vampires being killed by a wooden stake through the heart, although Bram Stoker based this idea on practices described in folklore.
Drive a stake through its heart.
Moment's courage and it is done.
Shove a stake right up his ass!
Additionally, Dracula can crawl vertically across the walls of his castle and can change his shape. In the novel, he appears in the form of a wolf, a bat, and mist, all of which have since become iconic vampire forms. However, in the original Dracula novel, sunlight is not fatal to vampires, although it does cause Dracula some discomfort.
Why can't they stand the sunlight?
The idea that vampires could be killed by daylight first appeared in the 1922 film Nosferatu. Nosferatu was essentially an adaptation of Dracula, but the filmmakers had to change the name and other key details because Bram Stoker's widow wouldn't give them the rights to adapt his work. Nosferatu's depiction of vampires as being vulnerable to sunlight was so influential that by 1958, the film version of Dracula included it as well. From here, vampires would become a staple of early horror film, starting with the 1931 movie version of Dracula.
I am Dracula.
Produced during the golden age of horror. For early filmmakers, it was convenient that vampires were pale and nocturnal, because white makeup showed up well against dark backgrounds on black and white film. The original Dracula movie also made a star of actor Bela Lugosi, who would go on to have a successful career playing monsters in several horror films. Vampires would continue to feature heavily in cinema throughout the 20th century. In the 1960s, they would reach a global audience in several Hammer horror films. From the 1970s onward, vampires would remain common in film, to the point that Dracula has appeared in popular media more times than any other fictional character except for Sherlock Holmes. However, toward the end of the 20th century, vampires tended to be depicted less in horror stories and more in dramas and comedies, a trend which has only intensified. The vampire tropes are the same, but the stories use them in very different ways, updating them for each era. Nina Auerbach famously said that every age embraces the vampire it needs. But other writers have not been so positive, with one saying that vampires are by now just a rather overworked cultural trope. Author Neil Gaiman has also complained that the proliferation of vampire stories in recent decades has resulted in vampires no longer being scary. While it's true that vampires don't have as much power to scare audiences as they used to, they nevertheless remain popular in the public imagination. In this way, the vampire as a fictional character has an impressive ability to change in step with the times. Groom says that this is because vampires are good to think with. So good, in fact, that they can be used to think about almost anything. Over the decades, they have been invoked as metaphors for everything from anxiety about death and the afterlife, to consumerism, capitalism, power, sexuality, and questions over the limits of empirical knowledge. Our age has reworked the vampire into an all-embracing cipher, Groom explains. A cosmic vessel to be filled and refilled with endless readings and rereadings. As a result, the vampire is a figure that questions the very being of what it is to be human. We can still see this even in the newest wave of vampire fiction, like the series What We Do in the Shadows, where the show's humor arises from the ridiculousness of seeing vampires in the modern world.
The problems with living with other vampires are the vampires I have chosen to stay with.
All of this suggests that, as a cultural creation, vampires may have immortal life. From folklore to literature, classic horror films to modern comedy, the vampire's ability to be reinvented means that it's likely to be with us for a long time to come.